The cold October wind cut through Daniel's thin jacket like a knife. He pulled his knees closer to his chest as he sat in the doorway of what used to be a small grocery store. The windows were covered with newspaper, and someone had spray-painted words he couldn't read in the dim streetlight. This doorway had become his home for the past 3 nights, ever since the police had moved him from his previous spot under the bridge. 15 years old, and Daniel had been living on the streets for 8 long months. It felt like 8 years. Every day was the same struggle, finding food, staying warm, and trying to stay invisible. The city was full of people, but nobody really saw him. They walked past with their eyes glued to their phones, or they looked right through him like he was made of air. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning when a kind lady at the bus stop had given him half of her sandwich. Daniel reached into his worn backpack and pulled out his most precious possession, a small, cracked photo of his grandmother sitting at her old piano. The edges were worn from him looking at it so many times. "I miss you, Grandma," he whispered to the photo. His grandmother had been the only person who ever truly cared about him. When he was 7 years old, she would sit him down at her old upright piano every Sunday after church. Her wrinkled hands would guide his small fingers across the black and white keys, teaching him simple songs and scales. "Music is the language of the heart, little one," she used to say in her gentle voice. "When words aren't enough, music can say everything you feel inside." Those Sunday afternoons were the happiest memories of his childhood. The smell of her lavender perfume, the way the afternoon sun came through her lace curtains, and the magical sounds that came from her piano when she played. She taught him everything she knew: classical pieces, old gospel songs, and even some jazz numbers she remembered from her youth. But when Daniel was 10, his grandmother got sick. The cancer came fast and took her away before he could even understand what was happening. After the funeral, he was placed in foster care. The first family seemed nice enough, but they had 4 other kids and barely noticed when Daniel sat quietly in the corner. The second family was worse. They only seemed to care about the check they got from the state each month. By the time he was 14, Daniel had been in 6 different homes. Some families were kind but overwhelmed. Others treated him like a burden they had to bear. None of them had a piano, and when he asked about music lessons, they just laughed and said they couldn't afford such luxuries. The last family he lived with had been the worst. The father drank too much and yelled constantly, while the mother worked double shifts and was never home. When Daniel turned 15, they simply told him he was too much trouble and couldn't stay anymore. The social worker tried to find him another placement, but the system was overcrowded. There were too many kids and not enough homes. "You're almost 16, the social worker had said, not meeting his eyes. "You can probably make it on your own for a little while until we find something." That was 8 months ago, and Daniel was still waiting. Now, sitting in this cold doorway, he closed his eyes and remembered his grandmother's piano lessons. He placed his hands on his knees and moved his fingers like he was playing scales. His muscle memory was still there even after all this time. He could almost hear the notes in his head as his fingers moved across invisible keys. A police car drove slowly down the street, and Daniel quickly stuffed the photo back into his backpack. He had learned to make himself as small as possible when the police came around. Most of them weren't mean, but they had a job to do, and homeless kids weren't supposed to be sleeping in doorways. The car kept going, and Daniel let out a quiet sigh of relief. He pulled his thin blanket, really just an old towel he had found, around his shoulders and tried to get comfortable against the cold concrete. The streetlight above him flickered on and off, casting strange shadows on the empty street. As he sat there, Daniel thought about all the things other kids his age were probably doing right now. They were at home warm and safe, maybe doing homework or watching TV with their families. Some of them were probably complaining about having to practice piano or violin lessons their parents paid good money for. If only they knew how lucky they were. A late-night bus rumbled past, its bright windows showing glimpses of tired workers heading home after long shifts. Daniel wondered what it would be like to have a home to go to, a place where someone would ask how his day was and make sure he had dinner. The wind picked up again, and Daniel shivered. He reached into his backpack for his extra socks, the only other clothes he owned besides what he was wearing. As he pulled them out, his fingers brushed against something else at the bottom of the bag. It was a small piece of sheet music his grandmother had written herself. The paper was yellow and torn, but he could still see her careful handwriting at the top. Hope in the Darkness. She had been working on this song during her last few months, playing it over and over on her piano until she got it just right. Daniel had never learned to play it completely, but he remembered parts of the melody. Sometimes when the nights were really hard, he would hum those few notes to himself and feel a little less alone. A cat appeared from somewhere in the shadows and walked cautiously toward Daniel. It was orange and white, probably a stray like him. The cat sniffed around his feet for a moment, then decided he was safe enough and curled up next to his leg. Daniel reached down and gently petted its matted fur. "At least we have each other tonight, buddy," he whispered. The cat purred softly, and for a few minutes, Daniel felt a tiny bit of warmth that had nothing to do with body heat. Even this small connection with another living creature reminded him that he wasn't completely invisible. He mattered to this cat, at least for tonight. As the hours passed, Daniel dozed fitfully against the cold wall. He dreamed of his grandmother's piano, of Sunday afternoons filled with music and love. In his dreams, he was still that little boy with clean clothes and a warm home, learning songs and feeling like the world was full of possibilities. When he woke up the next morning, the cat was gone, but the sun was shining, and Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a tiny spark of hope. Maybe today would be different. Maybe today something would change. He carefully folded his grandmother's sheet music and put it back in his bag, along with her photo. Then he stood up, brushed off his clothes, and started walking down the street looking for whatever the day might bring. His fingers moved silently at his sides, practicing scales as he walked, keeping the music alive in his heart even when there was no piano to play. 3 days later, dark clouds gathered overhead like a gray blanket about to smother the city. Daniel had been walking around the downtown area, trying to find somewhere warm to spend the afternoon. The library was usually a good place to hide for a few hours, but today they were closed for some kind of maintenance work. The first drops of rain started falling just as he turned the corner onto Pine Street. Within minutes, what had been a light drizzle turned into a proper downpour. People around him opened umbrellas or ducked into nearby shops, but Daniel had nowhere to go. His thin jacket was already soaked through, and water was running down his face and neck. He spotted a large brick building across the street with a sign that read, Riverside Community Center. Daniel had walked past this place many times but had never paid much attention to it. There were usually people going in and out during the day, families with children, elderly folks, teenagers in groups. It looked like the kind of place where people belonged, where they had reasons to be there. As the rain got heavier, Daniel ran across the street and found a small overhang near the back of the building where he could wait out the storm. He pressed himself against the wall, watching the water pour off the roof like a waterfall. His teeth were chattering and his hands were turning blue from the cold. That's when he noticed something strange. The back door of the community center was slightly open, just a crack, but enough to let a thin line of warm air escape into the cold afternoon. Daniel looked around to make sure no one was watching, then moved closer to the door. He could hear voices from somewhere inside the building, but they sounded far away, like they were coming from the front of the building. He pressed his ear to the crack in the door and listened carefully. The voices seemed to be moving away, getting fainter. Then he heard the sound of a front door closing and the beep of an alarm system being set. After that, everything was quiet. Daniel stood there for several minutes, shivering in the rain, trying to decide what to do. He had never broken into anywhere before, but he was so cold and wet that he could barely think straight. Finally, his survival instincts took over, and he pushed the door open just wide enough to slip inside. The warmth hit him immediately like a gentle hug. Daniel stood just inside the door, dripping water onto the floor, and let his eyes adjust to the dim light. He was in a long hallway with doors on both sides. Everything was quiet except for the sound of rain hitting the windows and the soft hum of a heating system. He walked slowly down the hallway, past what looked like classrooms and offices. There were colorful posters on the walls advertising things like cooking classes, book clubs, and something called Senior Fitness Hour. This was clearly a place where the community came together, where people had activities and friends and normal lives. At the end of the hallway, Daniel found himself in a large main room with high ceilings and tall windows. There were folding chairs stacked against one wall, a small stage at the far end, and tables pushed to the sides. But what made Daniel's heart nearly stop was what he saw in the corner of the room. An old upright piano. It was brown wood, darker than his grandmother's had been, and it looked like it had seen better days. Some of the keys were slightly yellowed, and there were scratches on the bench, but to Daniel it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in months. He walked toward it slowly, almost afraid it might disappear if he moved too fast. When he reached the piano, Daniel stood there for a long moment, just staring at it. His hands were still shaking from the cold, but now they were also shaking from excitement and nervousness. He hadn't touched a real piano since his grandmother died 5 years ago. What if he had forgotten everything she taught him? What if his fingers didn't remember how to move across the keys? Daniel looked around the room one more time to make sure he was really alone. The rain was still pounding against the windows and everything outside looked gray and empty. Slowly, he sat down on the piano bench and lifted the cover that protected the keys. The black and white keys looked exactly like he remembered from his grandmother's piano. Daniel placed his hands in position and took a deep breath. Then very gently, he pressed middle C with his right index finger. The sound that came out was like a voice from his past. It wasn't perfectly tuned. The note was a little flat, but it was real music, the first real music Daniel had heard in years. He pressed a few more keys, then tried a simple scale. His fingers were stiff and clumsy at first, but the muscle memory was still there, buried deep but not forgotten. Encouraged, Daniel tried playing a simple melody his grandmother had taught him when he was 8 years old. It was a folk song called Scarborough Fair, and she had always said it was perfect for beginners because it helped train the fingers to move independently. As he played, Daniel could almost hear his grandmother's voice humming along, the way she used to do during their Sunday lessons. The more he played, the more his confidence grew. His fingers began to remember patterns and movements he thought he had lost forever. He tried a few scales, some simple chord progressions, and then attempted one of the easier classical pieces his grandmother had taught him, a minuet by Bach that she said was good for developing precision and timing. It wasn't perfect. His timing was off in places, and he hit a few wrong notes, but the music was there. The magic his grandmother had taught him was still alive inside his hands, waiting all these years for a chance to come out again. As Daniel played, something amazing happened. For the first time in 8 months, he forgot about being hungry. He forgot about being cold and wet and homeless. He forgot about the fear that lived in his stomach every day, the worry about where he would sleep tonight and whether he would find food tomorrow. All of that melted away, and there was only the music. He played for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. He went through every piece he could remember, from simple children's songs to more complex classical compositions. With each song, more memories came flooding back. His grandmother's patient corrections, her proud smile when he finally got a difficult passage right, the way she would clap when he finished a piece. When his fingers finally got too tired to continue, Daniel sat back on the bench and looked at his hands. They were still pale and thin from months of poor nutrition, but they had just created something beautiful. They had brought music back into his life, even if just for a little while. The rain was starting to slow down outside, and Daniel knew he should probably leave before someone discovered him. He carefully closed the piano cover and stood up from the bench. But as he walked toward the door, he was already planning his return. This piano, this room, this moment of peace and music. It was like finding water in a desert. Daniel slipped back out through the rear door and into the gray afternoon. The rain had stopped, but everything was still wet and glistening. As he walked away from the community center, his step was a little lighter than it had been in months. His fingers moved at his sides, still practicing the pieces he had just played, keeping the music alive even without the piano. For the first time since his grandmother died, Daniel felt like maybe, just maybe, there was still some beauty left in the world. And maybe, if he was very careful and very lucky, he could find a way to be part of it again. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in his usual doorway, wrapped in his thin blanket, but his mind kept going back to the piano. His fingers moved constantly, practicing scales and melodies on invisible keys. Every few minutes he would remember a new piece his grandmother had taught him, and his excitement would grow stronger. By the third night, Daniel had worked up the courage to return to the community center. He waited until well after dark, when the streets were mostly empty and the building had been quiet for hours. The back door was unlocked again, just like before. Daniel slipped inside, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. This time he brought a small flashlight he had found in a dumpster behind an electronics store. He didn't want to turn on the main lights and risk someone seeing them from outside. The thin beam of light guided him down the familiar hallway to the main room where his piano waited. Daniel sat down at the bench and began to play softly, trying to keep the volume low. He started with simple scales to warm up his fingers, then moved on to the folk songs his grandmother had taught him first. Each night more memories came back to him. He remembered a lullaby she used to play when he couldn't sleep, a Christmas carol they had practiced together one December, and a jazzy little tune she said reminded her of her younger days. After a week of secret visits, Daniel's fingers were becoming stronger and more flexible. The months of malnutrition and cold had made them stiff and weak, but regular practice was bringing them back to life. He could play for longer periods without getting tired, and his accuracy was improving every night. One evening, as Daniel was working through a particularly challenging piece by Chopin that his grandmother had started teaching him just before she got sick, he suddenly remembered something important. His grandmother had been working on a composition of her own during her final months. She called it Hope in the Darkness, and she had played it over and over, making little changes and improvements each time. Daniel reached into his backpack and pulled out the yellowed sheet music he had been carrying with him. By the light of his small flashlight, he studied the notes his grandmother had written in her careful handwriting. The melody was more complex than anything he had attempted since finding the piano, but he was determined to learn it. He started slowly, playing just the right-hand melody first. The notes were haunting and beautiful, starting soft and sad but gradually building to something more hopeful. Daniel could almost hear his grandmother's voice humming along as he played. This song had been important to her, especially near the end when she was sick and scared. Learning the left-hand accompaniment was harder. His grandmother had written complex chord progressions that required him to stretch his fingers in ways he hadn't done in years. But Daniel was patient, working through it measure by measure, night after night. When he made mistakes, he could almost hear his grandmother's gentle corrections. "Take your time, little one. The music isn't going anywhere. Let it flow naturally." As the weeks passed, Daniel's nightly visits to the community center became the highlight of his existence. During the day, he would wander the streets, looking for food and trying to stay warm. But he was really just waiting for darkness to fall so he could return to his piano. He began to think of it as his piano, even though he knew he was just borrowing it without permission. The building's heating system kept the main room comfortably warm, which was a blessing as the October nights grew colder. Daniel would sometimes arrive shivering from hours in the cold street, but within minutes of sitting at the piano, his whole body would relax and warm up. The music seemed to heat him from the inside out. One night, Daniel decided to try something he had never attempted before. His grandmother had taught him about improvisation, making up music as you play instead of following written notes. She said it was like having a conversation between your heart and your fingers, letting them discover melodies together. Daniel placed his hands on the keys and just started playing whatever came to mind. At first it sounded random and disconnected, but gradually a melody began to emerge. It was sad at first, reflecting all the loneliness and fear he had experienced over the past months. But as he continued playing, the music began to change, becoming stronger and more hopeful. He played about his grandmother and how much he missed her. He played about the foster homes and the feeling of never quite belonging anywhere. He played about sleeping in doorways and being invisible to the world. But he also played about the kindness of strangers, the woman who had shared her sandwich, the cat that had slept beside him one cold night, and the discovery of this piano that had given him back a piece of his soul. As Daniel played his improvised song, tears began to roll down his cheeks. He hadn't cried in months, not since the early days on the street when he still believed someone might come to rescue him. But this wasn't the desperate crying of those early days. This was something different, a release of all the emotions he had been holding inside, transformed into something beautiful through the magic of music. When he finally stopped playing, Daniel sat in the quiet darkness for a long time. The silence felt different now, not empty but full of the music that had just filled the room. He realized that his grandmother had been right about music being the language of the heart. When he couldn't find words for everything he was feeling, the piano had spoken for him. Daniel began to experiment with combining his improvisation with his grandmother's composition. He would play Hope in the Darkness as she had written it, then let his fingers wander into their own melodies, creating bridges between her music and his own emotions. It felt like having a conversation with her across time and death, her carefully crafted notes mixing with his spontaneous expressions of love and loss. Some nights, Daniel would play for hours, losing himself completely in the music. Other nights, he would just sit at the piano for a few minutes, playing simple scales or familiar melodies, to remind himself that this beautiful part of his life was real. The piano became his anchor, the one constant good thing in a world that had become unpredictable and harsh. As November approached and the nights grew colder, Daniel's secret sessions became even more precious to him. He knew he was taking a risk every time he entered the building, but he couldn't stay away. The music had become as necessary to him as food or shelter, maybe more necessary. It fed a part of his soul that had been starving for years. One particularly cold night, as Daniel was playing a gentle Bach prelude his grandmother had loved, he found himself wondering what she would think of his situation now. Would she be proud that he had kept the music alive in his heart through all these difficult months? Would she understand why he had to borrow this piano to reconnect with the gift she had given him? Daniel thought she would understand. Music had always been about more than just following rules for his grandmother. It was about expressing truth and beauty and hope, even in the darkest times. And if that meant playing on a borrowed piano in an empty community center, she would probably just smile and ask him to play her favorite song. As he finished the prelude and prepared to pack up for the night, Daniel made a promise to himself and to his grandmother's memory. No matter what happened to him, no matter how difficult life became, he would find a way to keep playing. The music was too important, too beautiful, and too much a part of who he was to ever let it go again. 3 weeks into his secret visits to the community center, Daniel had become comfortable with his routine. He knew exactly when to arrive, usually around 10 o'clock at night when the streets were quieter. He knew how long he could safely stay, typically 2 or 3 hours before he needed to leave and find somewhere to sleep for the rest of the night. Most importantly, he knew the building's rhythms and sounds, so he felt confident that he was always alone with his music. On this particular Tuesday evening, Daniel was feeling especially good about his progress. He had finally mastered the most difficult section of his grandmother's composition, Hope in the Darkness. His fingers were moving with more confidence and strength than they had in months, and he was beginning to feel like a real pianist again, not just someone desperately trying to remember how to play. Daniel settled at the piano and began with his usual warm-up exercises. Then he moved into some of the classical pieces his grandmother had taught him, a Mozart sonata, a Chopin waltz, and a Bach invention that had always been one of his favorites. His playing was flowing and expressive, and he was completely lost in the music. As he finished the Bach piece, Daniel decided it was time to work on Hope in the Darkness again. This song had become the centerpiece of his practice sessions, the bridge between his memories of his grandmother and his current life. He placed his grandmother's sheet music on the piano and began to play. The melody started soft and melancholy, expressing the sadness and uncertainty of difficult times. But as the piece progressed, it began to build toward something more uplifting. His grandmother had crafted it perfectly, first acknowledging the darkness, then slowly introducing light and hope. Daniel played with all the emotion he had been carrying for months, pouring his heart into every note. He was so absorbed in the music that he didn't hear the soft footsteps in the hallway. He didn't notice the door to the main room opening quietly, or the figure that stepped inside and stood listening in the shadows. Daniel was completely focused on the piano, on making his grandmother's final composition sound as beautiful as she had intended it to be. As he reached the climactic section of the piece, where the hope finally overcomes the darkness, Daniel played with passion and skill that surprised even himself. His fingers danced across the keys with confidence, and the music filled the large room with its powerful message of resilience and faith. When he finished the piece, Daniel sat back with satisfaction, his hands still resting on the keys. That had been his best performance yet. He felt like his grandmother would have been proud of how he had interpreted her music, how he had understood the story she was trying to tell. Then he heard something that made his blood run cold, the sound of someone clapping softly behind him. Daniel spun around on the piano bench, his heart racing with fear. In the dim light from his flashlight, he could see a woman standing near the doorway. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was wearing jeans and a sweater, and she had tears running down her cheeks. For a moment, they just stared at each other in the semi-darkness. Daniel's mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should he run? Should he try to explain? Was she going to call the police? He felt like a deer caught in headlights, frozen with panic. The woman took a step closer, and Daniel could see that she wasn't angry or frightened. Instead, she looked amazed and deeply moved by what she had just heard. "Please," she said softly, "don't stop playing." Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He had been caught, and he didn't know what that meant for his future. This piano, these precious hours of music, might be about to disappear from his life forever. The woman seemed to understand his fear. She moved slowly toward one of the folding chairs along the wall and sat down, keeping some distance between them so he wouldn't feel trapped. "I'm Isabella," she said in a gentle voice. "I'm the director of this community center. I was working late in my office, finishing up some paperwork, when I heard the most beautiful music coming from this room. I had to come see who was playing." Daniel still couldn't find his voice. He was shaking, partly from fear and partly from the adrenaline of being discovered after weeks of secrecy. Isabella noticed his distress and spoke even more softly. "You're not in trouble, honey. That was the most beautiful playing I've heard in years. Where did you learn to play like that?" Finally, Daniel managed to whisper. "My grandmother taught me." "She must have been a wonderful teacher," Isabella said, "and a wonderful musician herself. Was that her composition you were playing?" Daniel nodded, surprised that she had recognized it as an original piece.
"She wrote it before she died."
She called it Hope in the Darkness. Isabella wiped away a tear. "It's perfect. The title fits the music perfectly. Your grandmother was very talented, and so are you." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Daniel began to realize that maybe this woman wasn't going to call the police or ban him from the building. She seemed genuinely interested in his music, not angry about his unauthorized presence. "I've been wondering who is playing piano in here at night," Isabella said. "I work late sometimes, and I've heard music several times over the past few weeks. I thought maybe it was one of our evening class instructors practicing, but they all have keys and would turn on the lights." Daniel looked down at his hands, embarrassed. "I'm sorry for breaking in. I know I shouldn't be here, but I needed to play so badly, and this was the only piano I could find." "How long has it been since you played on a real piano?" Isabella asked. 5 years, Daniel said quietly. "Since my grandmother died." Isabella's expression grew even more compassionate. "And you've been carrying all that music inside you for 5 years, waiting for a chance to let it out." Daniel nodded, feeling tears start to form in his eyes. "I practice on imaginary keys all the time, but it's not the same. When I found this piano, it was like coming home." "Where is your home now?" Isabella asked gently. Daniel hesitated. He wasn't used to talking about his situation with adults. Most of them either didn't believe him or immediately started talking about social services and systems that had already failed him. But something about Isabella's manner made him feel like maybe she would understand. "I don't really have one," he said finally. "I've been living on the streets for a while." Isabella's eyes filled with tears again, but she didn't gasp or immediately start asking a million questions like most adults did. Instead, she just nodded and said, "That must be very difficult." "It is," Daniel admitted. "But finding this piano, it's been like having a little piece of home again, even if it's just for a few hours at night." Isabella stood up slowly, and Daniel tensed, thinking she might be going to call someone or ask him to leave. Instead, she walked over to the wall and turned on the main lights in the room. "Would you play something else for me?" she asked. "I'd love to hear more of your music." Daniel blinked in the sudden brightness, then looked at Isabella's face. She was smiling encouragingly, and her eyes were warm and kind. For the first time in months, he felt like an adult was actually seeing him as a person, not just as a problem to be solved. "What would you like to hear?" Daniel asked, his voice growing a little stronger. "Whatever you'd like to play," Isabella said, settling back into her chair. "I just want to listen to your gift." Daniel turned back to the piano and thought for a moment. Then he began to play one of his grandmother's favorite pieces, a gentle Chopin nocturne that she had always said reminded her of moonlight on water. As he played, He could feel Isabella listening behind him, and for the first time in his life he was sharing his music with someone who truly appreciated it. When he finished, Isabella applauded warmly. "That was absolutely beautiful. Your grandmother taught you well, but you have something special that can't be taught. You have a real gift." Daniel turned around to face her, and for the first time in months he smiled genuinely. Maybe being discovered wasn't the disaster he had feared. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something better. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel's life changed in ways he had never imagined possible. Isabella had not only allowed him to continue using the piano, but she had given him a key to the building and permission to practice whenever he wanted. More than that, she had become the first adult in years who seemed to genuinely care about his well-being. Isabella would often stay late at the community center just to listen to Daniel play. She brought him sandwiches and hot chocolate, and slowly, Daniel began to trust her enough to share more of his story. He told her about the foster homes, about sleeping in doorways, about the constant hunger and cold. Isabella listened without judgment, offering comfort and practical help where she could. "You know," Isabella said one evening as Daniel finished playing a particularly beautiful piece, "our annual fundraising dinner is coming up next month. It's our biggest event of the year. We raise money to fund programs for people in need in our community." Daniel nodded politely, not sure why she was telling him this. "Every year, we have some kind of entertainment during dinner," Isabella continued. "Usually it's a local band or a choir from one of the schools. But this year I was thinking we might try something different." She paused and looked at Daniel meaningfully. "I was wondering if you might consider performing for our guests." Daniel's hands froze on the piano keys. "Me? Perform in front of people?" "Think about it," Isabella said gently. "Your music is extraordinary. These are people who care about helping others in our community. When they hear your story and your incredible talent, I know they'll be moved to help even more people who are struggling like you have been." Daniel felt a wave of panic wash over him. He had been performing for Isabella for 2 weeks now, but she was just one person and she was kind and understanding. The idea of playing in front of a room full of strangers was terrifying. "I don't know," Daniel said quietly. "I've never performed for a big group before. What if I mess up? What if they don't like it?" Isabella moved her chair closer to the piano. "Daniel, honey, you have a gift that deserves to be shared. Your music has the power to touch people's hearts and maybe even change their lives. Don't you think your grandmother would want you to share that gift with the world?" The mention of his grandmother made Daniel pause. He remembered how proud she had always been when he played for the small congregation at her church, how she would beam with joy when people complimented his playing. She had always believed that music was meant to be shared, not hidden away. "Besides," Isabella added with a smile, "the money we raise from this dinner funds our youth programs. Some of that money will go to help other kids who are in situations like yours. Your music could literally help change lives." That argument resonated with Daniel more than anything else. The idea that his playing could help other homeless or struggling kids made the scary prospect of performing seem more worthwhile. "What kind of people come to this dinner?" Daniel asked. "All kinds," Isabella said. "Local business owners, teachers, retirees, families who care about their community. They're good people, Daniel. They come because they want to help make things better for everyone." Daniel thought about it for several days. Every time he sat at the piano, he imagined what it would be like to play for a room full of people. The idea still scared him, but it also excited him a little. His grandmother had always said that music was like a conversation between the performer and the audience, and Daniel had been having conversations with just himself for so long. Finally, he made his decision. "Okay," he told Isabella one evening. "I'll do it. But I want to play my grandmother's song, Hope in the Darkness, I think. I think she would like that." Isabella's eyes lit up with joy. "That would be perfect. It's exactly the right message for this event." The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Isabella arranged for Daniel to have some new clothes for the performance. Not fancy, but clean and well-fitting. She also made sure he had access to showers and regular meals at the community center, which helped him gain back some of the weight he had lost during his months on the street. Daniel practiced Hope in the Darkness obsessively, working on every nuance and detail. He wanted to honor his grandmother's memory by playing her composition as beautifully as possible. Isabella sometimes sat and listened, offering encouragement and gentle suggestions. Remember, she would say, you're not just playing notes on a page. You're telling a story, your story and your grandmother's story, and the story of everyone who has ever struggled to find hope in difficult times. As the night of the fundraising dinner approached, Daniel's nervousness grew stronger. He would wake up in the middle of the night with his heart racing, imagining all the ways the performance could go wrong. What if he forgot the music? What if his hands shook so badly he couldn't play? What if the audience didn't understand or appreciate his grandmother's composition? Isabella seemed to sense his growing anxiety. You know what? She said a few days before the event. I've been thinking about how to introduce you to the audience. Daniel looked up from the piano, where he had been practicing the same difficult passage for the 10th time. I don't want to tell them your whole story before you play, Isabella continued. I think the music should speak first. So I'm just going to introduce you as a young man with a special gift to share, and let your playing do the rest of the talking. That made Daniel feel a little better. He didn't want to be seen as a charity case or someone to be pitied. He wanted to be seen as a musician, someone who had something valuable to offer. The night before the performance, Daniel barely slept. He lay in the small room Isabella had arranged for him at the community center, staring at the ceiling and running through the music over and over in his mind. His grandmother's sheet music lay on the table beside his bed, and occasionally he would pick it up and study her handwriting by lamplight. I hope I make you proud, Grandma, he whispered to the photo he kept beside the sheet music. The day of the fundraising dinner, Daniel spent most of his time at the piano, playing through his piece slowly and carefully. His fingers felt good, strong and confident from weeks of regular practice and proper nutrition. The music flowed naturally now, like it was as much a part of him as breathing. As the evening approached, Isabella helped Daniel get dressed in his new clothes. They were simple but nice, dark pants, a white shirt, and a navy blue sweater that Isabella said brought out his eyes. Looking in the mirror, Daniel barely recognized himself. He looked like a normal teenager, not someone who had been living on the streets. You look wonderful, Isabella said, adjusting his collar slightly. Are you ready for this? Daniel took a deep breath and nodded. I think so. I'm scared, but I'm ready, Isabella smiled. Being scared is normal. Even professional musicians get nervous before performances. The important thing is that you're going to share something beautiful with people who need to hear it. As they walked toward the main room where the dinner was being held, Daniel could hear the sound of conversation and laughter. Through the doorway, he could see tables set with white tablecloths and flowers and people in nice clothes enjoying their meals. It looked like a completely different world from the one Daniel had been living in for the past year. They're just people, Isabella said quietly, noticing his nervousness. People who care about making their community better. They're going to love your music. Daniel nodded and tried to calm his racing heart. In a few minutes, he would sit at the piano in front of all these strangers and play his grandmother's most precious composition. He would tell her story and his story through music, and hope that somehow the beauty of the song would bridge the gap between his world and theirs. Isabella squeezed his shoulder gently. Remember, your grandmother's spirit will be with you up there. You're not playing alone. With that thought in his mind, Daniel walked toward his moment to shine. The main room of the community center had been transformed into an elegant dining space. Round tables covered with white cloths filled the room, each decorated with small flower arrangements and glowing candles. About 80 people were seated throughout the space, their conversations creating a warm buzz of voices mixed with the gentle clinking of silverware and glasses. Daniel stood in the side doorway with Isabella, watching the scene and trying to calm his racing heart. The guests looked exactly like what Isabella had described, a mix of ages and backgrounds, but all clearly people who cared about their community. There were elderly couples sharing quiet conversations, young families with children, middle-aged professionals, and groups of friends enjoying the evening together. At the front of the room, the old upright piano had been moved to a small raised platform that served as a stage. Someone had polished it until it gleamed in the soft lighting, and Daniel's grandmother's sheet music was already placed carefully on the music stand. Seeing the piano there, waiting for him, made everything feel suddenly very real. Ladies and gentlemen, Isabella said, moving to the front of the room with a wireless microphone.
Thank you all for joining us tonight for our annual community fundraising dinner.
Your support helps us provide programs and services for people throughout our neighborhood who need a helping hand. The room gradually quieted as people turned their attention to Isabella. Daniel remained hidden in the doorway, his hands shaking slightly as he watched the audience. Tonight, instead of our usual entertainment, we have something very special to share with you, Isabella continued. Music has always been an important part of what we do here at the community center. We believe that art and beauty have the power to heal, to inspire, and to bring people together across all kinds of differences. Isabella paused and looked toward the doorway where Daniel was standing. She gave him an encouraging smile and a small nod. This evening, we're honored to have a young man share his extraordinary musical gift with us. His music tells a story of resilience, hope, and the power of human connection. Please join me in welcoming Daniel. The audience applauded politely as Daniel walked nervously toward the piano. The room seemed much larger from this perspective, and all those faces looking at him felt overwhelming. But as he approached the piano bench, he caught sight of Isabella's encouraging smile, and he remembered her words about his grandmother's spirit being with him. Daniel sat down at the piano and adjusted the bench to the right height. His hands were trembling as he placed them on the keys, and for a moment, he worried that he might not be able to play at all. The silence in the room felt heavy, with everyone waiting to hear what he would do. He looked down at his grandmother's sheet music and saw her careful handwriting at the top. Hope in the darkness. Suddenly, he could almost hear her voice. Take your time, little one. Let the music flow naturally. Don't think about anything except telling the story. Daniel took a deep breath and began to play. The opening notes were soft and melancholy, expressing the sadness and uncertainty that his grandmother had felt during her illness. But they were also beautiful, carrying a dignity and grace that spoke to the strength she had maintained even in her darkest moments. Daniel's nervousness began to fade as he lost himself in the familiar melody. As the piece progressed, the music began to tell its story. The early section spoke of loss and fear, of times when hope seemed impossible to find. Daniel thought about his own experiences, the loneliness of foster care, the terror of those first nights on the street, the constant hunger and cold. But he also thought about his grandmother's courage, her determination to finish this composition even when she was very sick. The audience was completely silent now, captivated by the haunting beauty of the music and the obvious skill and emotion with which Daniel was playing. Several people had stopped eating entirely, their forks forgotten as they listened to the story unfolding at the piano. In the middle section of the piece, the music began to change. The sad melody was still there, but new harmonies began to weave around it, suggesting that even in darkness there might be reasons to keep going. Daniel played this section with particular tenderness, remembering how his grandmother had explained that hope wasn't about pretending everything was fine, but about believing that love and beauty could survive even the worst circumstances. An elderly woman at a table near the front began to cry quietly, remembering her own struggles with illness and loss. A young father thought about his children and the challenges they would face in life, feeling grateful that they would have people who loved them to help them through difficult times. A businessman who had come reluctantly to the dinner found himself deeply moved by the raw emotion and skill of this unexpected performance. As Daniel moved into the final section of the composition, the music began to build toward its resolution. The hopeful melodies grew stronger and more confident, interweaving with the earlier sad themes to create something complex and beautiful. This wasn't simple happiness replacing sadness. It was the recognition that both could exist together, and that surviving darkness made the light even more precious. Daniel played the climactic passage with passion and skill that surprised even himself. His grandmother had written this section to be triumphant without being overwhelming, and Daniel understood exactly what she had been trying to express. This was the moment when hope finally overcame despair, not by defeating it completely, but by proving it could coexist with sorrow and even transform it into something beautiful. The final notes of Hope in the Darkness rang out clear and strong, then gradually faded into silence. Daniel sat with his hands still on the keys for a moment, feeling the presence of his grandmother's spirit so strongly that he almost expected to see her sitting in the audience, beaming with pride the way she used to at his childhood performances. For several seconds, the room remained completely silent. Then slowly, one person began to clap. Within moments, the entire audience was on their feet, applauding with an enthusiasm and emotion that Daniel had never experienced before. Several people were crying openly, and others were shaking their heads in amazement at what they had just witnessed. The standing ovation continued for what felt like forever. Daniel stood up from the piano bench and looked out at the audience, seeing tears on faces throughout the room. These weren't tears of pity or sympathy. They were tears of recognition, of people who had been touched by something truly beautiful and meaningful. Near the back of the room, a distinguished-looking man with gray hair was applauding enthusiastically while wiping tears from his eyes. This was Professor James Chen from the local music conservatory, who had attended the dinner as a favor to a friend, but was now witnessing one of the most moving musical performances he had ever heard. At a table near the middle of the room, a successful businessman named Robert Walsh was also crying, thinking about his own teenage years when his family had struggled financially, and he had felt alone and uncertain about his future. Daniel's music had reminded him of those feelings, but also of the power of perseverance and the importance of helping others who were struggling. Isabella walked up onto the small platform and put her arm around Daniel's shoulders as the applause finally began to die down. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said into the microphone, "the piece you just heard was composed by Daniel's grandmother during the final months of her life. She called it Hope in the Darkness, and I think you can understand why." The audience murmured appreciatively, and several people called out, "Bravo!" and "Beautiful." "Daniel has been practicing this piece and many others on our old piano here at the community center," Isabella continued. "His story is one of incredible resilience and the power of music to sustain us through the most difficult times. Your generous donations tonight will help us continue providing programs for young people like Daniel, who need support and opportunities to develop their talents." As Isabella spoke, Daniel looked out at the audience and realized that something fundamental had changed in his life. For the first time since his grandmother died, he felt truly seen and valued. These people weren't looking at him as a homeless kid or a charity case. They were looking at him as a musician, someone who had just shared something precious and meaningful with them. The evening was far from over, but Daniel already knew that this moment had changed everything. His grandmother's final composition had done exactly what she had hoped it would do. It had reminded people that hope could survive even in the darkest circumstances, and that beauty and love were more powerful than any temporary suffering. As the audience finally returned to their seats, still buzzing with excitement about the performance, Daniel realized that he was no longer the same frightened, invisible boy who had been sleeping in doorways just a few weeks ago. He was a musician with something valuable to offer the world, and people were finally ready to listen. The applause from Daniel's performance was still echoing in the room when people began approaching the small platform where he stood with Isabella. The first person to reach him was the elderly woman who had been crying during the performance. "Young man," she said, taking Daniel's hands in her weathered ones, "that was the most beautiful thing I've heard in 50 years. Your grandmother would be so proud of you." Behind her, Professor Chen was waiting patiently for his turn to speak. When the woman moved away, he stepped forward with an expression of amazement on his face. "Daniel," he said, "I'm James Chen, and I teach piano at the City Music Conservatory. I've been teaching music for 30 years, and I can honestly say that your performance tonight was extraordinary. You have a natural talent that can't be taught, combined with a musical understanding that goes far beyond your years." Daniel looked at Professor Chen uncertainly, not sure how to respond to such high praise from someone who was clearly a serious musician. "I would very much like to discuss your musical education with you," Professor Chen continued. "We have scholarship programs at the conservatory for talented students who need financial assistance. Would you be willing to come visit the school and perhaps audition for our program?" Before Daniel could answer, Robert Walsh, the businessman who had been so moved by the performance, joined the conversation. "Excuse me," he said to Professor Chen, "I couldn't help but overhear. I'm Robert Walsh, and I want you to know that if this young man needs financial support for his education, I would be honored to help make that possible." More people were gathering around now, all wanting to speak with Daniel and offer their support. A local music teacher offered to give him private lessons. A family who owned a piano store said they would be happy to provide him with an instrument to practice on. Several people pressed business cards into his hands, insisting that he call them if he needed anything at all. Isabella had to gently intervene to prevent Daniel from becoming overwhelmed by all the attention. "Everyone, please," she said with a smile. "Daniel is incredibly grateful for all your kind offers, But let's give him a chance to process everything that's happening. As the crowd around the platform began to disperse, Isabella noticed that one person had been quietly taking photos and video of the interactions. It was her friend Lisa, who worked for the local newspaper and had attended the dinner as a guest. "Isabella," Lisa said, approaching them, "I hope you don't mind, but I recorded Daniel's performance on my phone. It's absolutely incredible, and I think people need to hear this story. Would you and Daniel be comfortable with me sharing this on social media and possibly writing an article about it for the paper?" Isabella looked at Daniel questioningly. The idea of having his performance shared with even more people was both exciting and terrifying. "What do you think?" Isabella asked him. "It could help spread awareness about the work we do here at the community center, and it might inspire other people to help kids in situations like yours." Daniel thought about all the nights he had spent hungry and cold on the streets, and about other kids who might be going through the same thing right now. If his music could somehow help them, then maybe sharing it was the right thing to do. "Okay," he said quietly. "If you think it might help other people, then yes." Lisa smiled and gave Daniel her business card. "I'll make sure the story focuses on your incredible talent and the positive message of your grandmother's composition. This is going to be a beautiful story of hope and resilience." Over the next few days, Lisa's article appeared in the local newspaper with the headline "Homeless Teen's Piano. Performance Brings Audience to Tears." She had written a sensitive piece that focused on Daniel's musical gift and his grandmother's influence, while respectfully mentioning his difficult circumstances without sensationalizing them. But it was the video of Daniel's performance that really captured people's attention. Lisa had posted it on the newspaper's social media accounts, and within hours, it was being shared across the country. The combination of Daniel's obvious talent, the emotional power of his grandmother's composition, and the inspiring story behind the performance struck a chord with viewers everywhere. The video went viral faster than anyone could have predicted. Within a week, it had been viewed millions of times and shared by thousands of people. Comments poured in from around the world, with people expressing amazement at Daniel's talent and sharing their own stories of overcoming adversity through music and art. "This young man's playing brought me to tears," wrote one commenter. "The power of music to express what words cannot is incredible. I'm a professional pianist, and this performance is better than many I've heard in concert halls," wrote another. "This kid needs to be in a conservatory immediately." Many commenters also shared personal stories about their own grandparents who had taught them music, or about difficult times in their lives when art had helped them find hope. The video had become more than just a showcase of talent. It had become a symbol of resilience and the power of human connection. As the video continued to spread, offers of help began pouring in from around the country. Music schools offered scholarships, piano teachers volunteered free lessons, and individuals started sending donations to the community center, specifically to help Daniel and other young people in similar situations. Professor Chen called Isabella within days of the video going viral. "The response to Daniel's story has been overwhelming," he said. "Our conservatory would like to offer him a full scholarship, tuition, room, board, everything. We've also had alumni contact us wanting to contribute to a fund that would cover all his living expenses and provide him with a mentor program." Robert Walsh had been equally busy. He had established a formal foundation to support Daniel's education and had enlisted several other local business leaders to contribute. "We've raised enough money to ensure that Daniel never has to worry about basic necessities again," he told Isabella. "He can focus completely on his music and his education, but..." Perhaps the most touching response came from families who had seen the video and wanted to offer Daniel something he had been missing for years: a real home. 3 different families contacted the community center, expressing genuine interest in providing Daniel with a loving family environment, not just temporary housing. The Chen family was one of these families. Professor Chen and his wife Linda had 2 grown children of their own, and they had been deeply moved by Daniel's story and his obvious dedication to music. "We understand the challenges facing a talented young musician," Linda Chen had told Isabella. "We would love to provide Daniel with a stable, supportive home where he can continue developing his gift." Isabella sat down with Daniel one evening to discuss all the options that had suddenly become available to him. The community center's conference room table was covered with letters, emails, and business cards from people wanting to help. I can hardly believe this is all real, Daniel said, looking at the stack of opportunities spread out before him. A month ago, I was sleeping in doorways and wondering where my next meal would come from. Now all these people want to help me. Your music touched something deep in people's hearts, Isabella said. They recognize that you have a rare gift and they want to help you develop it. But more than that, your story reminded them of the power of hope and perseverance. You've inspired people, Daniel. As they went through the various offers, Daniel kept coming back to the Chen family's invitation. Professor Chen clearly understood music at the highest level, and the idea of living with a family who truly appreciated and supported his artistic development was appealing. The conservatory scholarship would provide him with world-class musical training, something he had never dared to dream possible. I think, Daniel said finally, I'd like to meet the Chen family and visit the conservatory. If it feels right, maybe that's the path I'm supposed to take. Isabella smiled. I think your grandmother would be amazed to see how her composition has changed your life. She wrote about hope in the darkness, and look how that hope has manifested, not just for you, but for all the people who have been inspired by your story. That night, Daniel sat at his piano in the community center and played Hope in the Darkness one more time. As his fingers moved across the familiar keys, he thought about the incredible journey that had brought him from sleeping in doorways to having opportunities he never could have imagined. But he also thought about other kids who were still out there, still struggling, still invisible to most of the world. The foundation that Robert Walsh had established wasn't just for Daniel, it was also funding new programs at the community center to help other homeless youth find their own paths to hope and stability. Daniel realized that his grandmother's composition had done something even more powerful than she had intended. It hadn't just helped him survive his darkest moments. It had become a beacon of hope for others who needed to believe that their circumstances could change, that their talents and dreams mattered, and that sometimes when you think no one is listening, the whole world might be waiting to hear your song. 6 months later, Daniel sat at a magnificent Steinway grand piano in the conservatory's main recital hall, preparing for the most important performance of his life. The concert hall was filled with music students, faculty, and guests who had come to hear the scholarship recipient's spring recital. But tonight felt different from any performance Daniel had given before. Because tonight he wasn't just playing for an audience. He was playing for a new future he had built with his own hands and heart. The past 6 months had transformed Daniel's life in ways he was still learning to understand. Living with the Chen family had been like discovering what a real home could feel like. Professor Chen had become not just his teacher, but a father figure who understood both music and the complex emotions that Daniel carried from his difficult past. Linda Chen had welcomed him into their family with warmth and patience, helping him navigate everything from grocery shopping to doing laundry, simple life skills that he had never had the chance to learn properly. The conservatory had been equally transformative. Daniel was studying with some of the finest musicians in the country, learning not just advanced technique but also music theory, composition, and performance practice. His natural talent, combined with his hunger to learn and his deep emotional connection to music, had made him one of the most promising students in the program. But perhaps the most meaningful part of Daniel's new life was what he had chosen to do with his growing platform and influence. The video of his original performance at the community center fundraiser had now been viewed over 10 million times, and Daniel had received thousands of messages from people around the world who had been touched by his story. More importantly, the foundation that Robert Walsh had established in Daniel's name had grown far beyond anyone's expectations. Donations continued to pour in from people who wanted to support music education for underprivileged youth. The program that Isabella had started at the community center now served over 50 young people, providing music lessons, instruments, and mentorship to kids who otherwise would never have access to such opportunities. Daniel had insisted on being actively involved in this program. Every Saturday he returned to the community center where his journey had begun, working with younger students who reminded him of himself just months earlier. Some of them were homeless, others were in foster care, and many were simply from families who couldn't afford music lessons. Daniel found that teaching these kids was almost as fulfilling as performing himself. Remember, he would tell his students, music isn't about playing perfectly. It's about expressing what's in your heart. Your experiences, even the difficult ones, give you something unique to share through your playing. Tonight's recital was special because Daniel had chosen to premiere a new composition, his own arrangement of his grandmother's, Hope in the Darkness for piano and orchestra. Working with his composition teacher, he had expanded the piece into a full concerto movement that maintained the intimate emotional core of his grandmother's original while adding layers of complexity and orchestral color. As Daniel waited backstage, he held the original sheet music his grandmother had written. The paper was now carefully preserved in a protective sleeve, but he still carried it with him to important performances as a reminder of where his musical journey had begun. Professor Chen approached him in the green room behind the stage. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Nervous," Daniel admitted, "but also excited. I keep thinking about how my grandmother would react if she could see all of this. The orchestra, the concert hall, the audience full of people who came to hear her music. She would be incredibly proud," Professor Chen said. "Not just of your musical development, but of the young man you've become. The way you've used your success to help other kids. The maturity and grace you've shown in handling all the attention. Those are the qualities that make you truly special." Through the backstage curtains, Daniel could see the orchestra musicians taking their places on stage. The conductor, Maestro Rodriguez, had been particularly excited about premiering Daniel's arrangement. "This piece has something that you can't teach," she had said during rehearsals. "It has authentic emotion and a story that needs to be told." As the announcement was made and Daniel walked onto the stage, he was struck by how different this felt from that terrifying night at the community center fundraiser. He was still nervous, but it was the good kind of nervousness, the excitement of sharing something meaningful with people who were ready to listen. The orchestra began with a gentle introduction that Daniel had composed to set the scene. The music painted a picture of twilight settling over a quiet neighborhood, establishing the contemplative mood that would carry throughout the piece. When Daniel's piano entrance came, he began with the familiar melody that his grandmother had crafted, but now it was supported by rich orchestral harmonies that added new dimensions to the emotional landscape. As Daniel played, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment, the lonely nights in doorways, the discovery of the piano at the community center, the fear and excitement of that first performance, and all the kindness that had followed. Each section of the music told part of that story, weaving together themes of loss, survival, hope, and ultimately, transformation. In the audience, Isabella sat with tears of pride streaming down her face. Beside her, Robert Walsh was equally moved, thinking about how a simple decision to attend a community center fundraiser had led to such an incredible chain of events. Several of Daniel's fellow students from his Saturday program at the community center were also in the audience, some of them performing publicly for the first time themselves as their confidence and skills grew. The Chen family occupied a special section near the front, watching their adopted son with the kind of unconditional love and pride that Daniel had never experienced before. Linda Chen held her husband's hand as they listened to the music that had first brought Daniel into their lives, now transformed into something even more beautiful and complex. As the piece built toward its climax, Daniel allowed himself to pour everything into the performance, all the pain and loneliness he had survived, all the gratitude he felt for the people who had believed in him, and all the hope he now carried for other young people who were still struggling to find their own paths forward. The final notes of the concerto rang out clear and triumphant, supported by the full orchestra in a celebration of resilience and the power of human connection. As the music faded into silence, Daniel sat at the piano for a moment, feeling his grandmother's presence as strongly as he had that night 6 months ago when everything changed. The standing ovation was immediate and thunderous, with audience members on their feet before the last note had fully died away. But this time Daniel wasn't overwhelmed by the response. He stood confidently, bowed graciously to the orchestra and conductor, and accepted the applause with the poise of someone who had learned to believe in his own worth. After the concert, as Daniel mingled with guests at the reception, he was approached by a young girl who looked to be about 12 years old. She had been in the audience with her parents, and she looked nervous but determined to speak with him. "Excuse me," she said shyly. "I just wanted to tell you that your music was beautiful. I'm learning piano too, but sometimes I get discouraged because it's hard and I don't think I'm very good. Daniel knelt down to her level and smiled. What's your name? Sophie, she said. Well, Sophie, can I tell you a secret? Every musician gets discouraged sometimes, even the best ones. The important thing isn't to play perfectly, it's to keep playing because you love it. Music has a way of healing things and connecting people in ways that nothing else can. He paused and thought about his own journey. You know what? If you really love music, don't give up on it, no matter what challenges you face. Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most difficult experiences. And your story, whatever it turns out to be, is worth telling through your playing. Sophie's face lit up with understanding and renewed determination. Thank you, she said. I won't give up. As Daniel watched her return to her parents, he realized that this was what his grandmother had really intended when she wrote Hope in the Darkness. It wasn't just about surviving difficult times. It was about transforming those experiences into something that could help and inspire others. Later that evening, as Daniel sat in his comfortable bedroom at the Chen house, he pulled out his phone and recorded a short video message that he posted to his social media accounts, which now had hundreds of thousands of followers. 6 months ago, I was sleeping in doorways and practicing piano on invisible keys, he said to the camera. Tonight I performed with a full orchestra in front of hundreds of people. But the most important thing I've learned isn't about music. It's about hope. No matter how dark things seem, no matter how alone you feel, your story isn't over. There are people who will believe in you, and there are gifts inside you that the world needs to experience. He paused and held up his grandmother's original sheet music. My grandmother wrote a song called Hope in the Darkness, and she was right. Hope can survive anything. But sometimes we have to be willing to share our darkness before we can find the light.